June 20th, 1972. The Oval Office, the White House. 11:26 a.m. President Richard Nixon sat behind the resolute desk, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the hidden control panel built into the wooden surface. With a single button press, he could activate the secret recording system that had been capturing every conversation in this room since February 9th. But today, for the first time since installing the system, Nixon was about to do something different. He was about to erase a recording, 18.5 minutes of conversation that could destroy his presidency, his legacy, his freedom. 3 days earlier, 5 men had been arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. They were carrying cameras, bugging equipment, and sequentially numbered $100 bills that traced back to Nixon's re-election campaign. The burglary should have been a minor scandal, a third-rate break-in that would fade from the headlines within a week. But Nixon knew something the press didn't know yet, something that made this break-in catastrophically dangerous. Something he had discussed with his Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman in the Oval Office 3 days ago on June 17th, just hours after the arrests. That conversation, the one Nixon was about to erase, contained the truth about Watergate. Not just who ordered the break-in, but why, and that why was far worse than anyone could imagine. Mr. President, Rosemary Woods, Nixon's personal secretary, stood in the doorway. The tape machine. "Are you sure you wanna?" "I know what I'm doing, Rose," Nixon interrupted, his voice sharp. "This is necessary. For national security." Rosemary Woods had worked for Richard Nixon for 23 years. She had seen him at his best and his worst. She knew when he was lying to others, and more importantly, she knew when he was lying to himself. This was the second kind of lie. Nixon genuinely believed that erasing this tape was about protecting national security, but Rosemary knew the truth. He was protecting himself. What neither of them realized was that the tape system had a backup feature, a redundant recording that even Nixon didn't know existed. And 25 years later, that backup would surface, revealing not just what Nixon said on June 17th, but proving he had ordered the Watergate break-in for reasons that went far beyond political espionage. The erased 18.5 minutes wouldn't stay erased forever, and when the truth finally came out, it would reveal that Watergate wasn't a cover-up of a burglary. It was a cover-up of something far darker, something that connected to conspiracies, blackmail, and crimes that made the break-in look like a parking ticket. But before we understand what Nixon erased, we need to understand how he got here. How a man who won the presidency by the largest landslide in American history in 1972 would be forced to resign in disgrace just 2 years later. This is the story of the Watergate tapes, the recordings that destroyed a presidency, and the 18.5 minutes that almost stayed secret forever. Fermertro, 1971. 15 months before Watergate. The idea to install a secret recording system in the Oval Office wasn't originally Nixon's. It came from his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, who had been frustrated by the president's habit of denying conversations that had actually happened. "Mr. President, we need a system to document everything," Haldeman argued during a private meeting. "When people claim you said something you didn't say, or deny you gave orders you clearly gave, we need proof." Nixon was initially resistant. He understood the danger of recorded conversations. Everything said in anger, every profane outburst, every politically sensitive discussion, all of it would be preserved forever. But Haldeman persisted. Johnson had a recording system. Kennedy had one too. It's standard procedure for modern presidents. And sir, with all due respect, you have a tendency to reinterpret past conversations in ways that don't always match what actually happened. Nixon bristled at the implication that he was dishonest with himself. But he knew Haldeman was right. Nixon did have a habit of remembering conversations the way he wished they'd gone rather than the way they actually went. "Fine," Nixon finally agreed, "but it has to be completely secret. Nobody knows about it except you, me, and whoever installs it." The Secret Service technical team installed the system over a weekend in February 1971. Microphones were hidden in the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, Nixon's executive office building hideaway, and even in the presidential telephones. The system was voice-activated. It would start recording automatically whenever someone spoke. Nixon could also manually control it through a hidden switch on his desk, allowing him to turn the system off for particularly sensitive conversations, or so he thought. What Nixon didn't know was that the Secret Service had installed a fail-safe backup system that continued recording even when Nixon believed the main system was off. This backup system, tucked away in a secure room in the White House basement, would eventually be discovered during the Watergate investigation, but by then it would be too late to destroy the evidence. For the first year, the recording system seemed like a useful tool. Nixon would reference the tapes when he needed to prove what someone had said in a meeting. Haldeman used them to draft memos that accurately reflected presidential directives. But then came June 17th, the day everything changed. The day Nixon recorded a conversation he would spend the next 2 years trying to hide. The Watergate Hotel. 5 men dressed in business suits and surgical gloves broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters on the 6th floor of the Watergate Hotel complex. They carried sophisticated camera equipment, electronic bugging devices, and over $2,300 in cash, all in sequentially numbered $100 bills. Their mission was simple: photograph documents and repair a listening device they had installed during a previous break-in 3 weeks earlier. The device wasn't working properly, and they needed to fix it before the Democratic National Convention in July. But at 2:30 a.m., a security guard named Frank Wills noticed tape covering the latches on several doors, preventing them from locking. Suspicious, Wills called the police. Within minutes, plainclothes officers arrived and arrested all 5 burglars. The men refused to identify themselves beyond giving false names, but in their pockets police found address books containing a notation, W House, and WH, along with a phone number that, when called, connected directly to the White House. By 8 a.m., the story was on the news. 5 men arrested in Democratic offices burglary. Most newspapers buried it on page 37. It seemed like a minor crime story. Dumb burglars getting caught in an amateur break-in. But at the White House, panic was setting in, because the 5 burglars weren't random criminals. They were connected to the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, and Nixon's re-election campaign organization. And more damning, they were connected to people inside the White House itself. By 1 p.m. on June 17th, Nixon's advisors were in crisis mode. H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, domestic policy advisor, and John Dean, White House counsel, met in Haldeman's office to assess the damage. These idiots kept White House phone numbers in their address books, Ehrlichman said, furious. The press is going to connect this to us within 24 hours. We need to contain this, Dean said. The burglars need to stay quiet. We can pay them, keep them from talking. How much? Haldeman asked. 100,000, maybe more, whatever it takes. They agreed to recommend this strategy to the president. At 4 p.m. they met Nixon in the Oval Office, and the recording system captured everything. June 17th, 9th. President, we have a problem, Haldeman began, closing the door behind him. Nixon, who had spent the day pretending he didn't know anything about the Watergate break-in, dropped the act. How bad is it? The 5 men arrested have direct connections to CREEP. One of them, James McCord, was our security coordinator. The press is going to trace this back to us. Nixon's face darkened. I told you this operation was too risky. I told you. Sir, with respect, you approved it. Ehrlichman interrupted. We have the memo you signed. This was the first critical moment. Nixon could have denied approving the break-in, could have claimed the memo was forged or that he'd signed it without reading it carefully. But he didn't. I approved gathering intelligence, Nixon said. I didn't approve getting caught. Haldeman pressed on. We need to decide how to handle this. Dean suggests paying the burglars to stay quiet. Hush money. 100,000 to start. Nixon thought for a moment. How do we get them the money? Through CREEP. Laundered through our campaign accounts. Untraceable. Do it, Nixon said. Then he paused, realizing the full implications. But we need to be smart about this. We can't just throw money at them and hope they stay quiet. We need to control the investigation itself. How? Dean asked. Nixon leaned back in his chair, the wheels turning. They're going to follow the money trail from the burglars back to CREEP, back to us. We need to stop that investigation. We can't stop the FBI, sir. That's obstruction of justice. We don't stop them, Nixon said, his voice cold and calculating. We redirect them. We tell them this break-in was actually a CIA operation, national security. The FBI can't investigate CIA operations without clearance. They'll have to back off. Haldeman looked uncertain, but it wasn't a CIA operation. The FBI doesn't know that. We tell the CIA director to call the FBI and say this is a national security matter. The CIA backs off, the FBI backs off, and the whole thing dies. This was the moment. The moment where Richard Nixon transformed from a president dealing with a campaign scandal into a president actively obstructing a federal investigation, and every word was being recorded. John Dean spoke up. Mr. President, if we do this, if we use the CIA to block the FBI investigation, that's a cover-up, that's obstruction of justice, that's impeachable. Nixon stared at him. Then we make sure nobody ever finds out we did it. That's why you're here, John, to protect me. The meeting continued for another 14 minutes. They discussed specific strategies, which CIA officials to approach, how to structure the hush money payments, which FBI agents could be trusted to drop the investigation, and most damning of all, they discussed destroying evidence. The files from CREEP, Nixon said. Everything related to intelligence gathering operations. Burn it. All of it. Sir, that's evidence in a federal investigation, Dean protested. It's campaign materials, Nixon shot back. We're allowed to dispose of our own campaign materials, but it wasn't campaign materials. It was evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond the Watergate break-in, evidence of other illegal operations, evidence that would destroy Nixon's presidency if it ever surfaced. This 18-and-a-half-minute conversation, the one Nixon would later try to erase, contained everything prosecutors would need to prove obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and abuse of power. It was the smoking gun, and Nixon had recorded it himself.
3 days after the break-in, Nixon realized his mistake almost immediately. After Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Dean left the Oval Office on June 17th, Nixon sat alone thinking about what they'd discussed, about what he'd ordered, about what had been recorded. He called Rosemary Woods into his office. "The tape system. The recordings from today. I need you to handle something for me." Rosemary, loyal to a fault, understood what he was asking. "You want me to erase something?" There was a conversation this afternoon about Watergate. Some of what was said could be misinterpreted. For national security reasons, that conversation needs to be removed from the record. Rosemary hesitated. She had worked for Nixon since 1951. She had helped him through the Checkers scandal, through his defeats, through his comeback. She believed in him, but this felt different. "Mr. President, if there's an investigation, destroying evidence, nobody knows about the tape system except us," Nixon interrupted. "This isn't destroying evidence, because officially, there is no evidence. The tapes don't exist as far as the public knows." This was technically true. The recording system was top secret. No one outside Nixon's inner circle knew it existed. "How much do you need me to erase?" Rosemary asked. 18.5 minutes, starting at 4:35 p.m. on June 17th. The next day, Rosemary Woods sat at the tape machine in her office, listening to the conversation Nixon wanted deleted. As she heard the president ordering the cover-up, approving hush money, discussing using the CIA to obstruct the FBI, she understood why Nixon wanted this gone. This tape could send him to prison, but erasing 18.5 minutes of tape without leaving obvious signs of tampering was technically difficult. Rosemary did her best, recording over the conversation with a continuous buzzing tone. But the result was obvious. Anyone listening to the tape could tell that something had been deliberately removed. "It's done," she told Nixon the next day. "But sir, it's noticeable. Anyone who listens will know something was erased." "That's fine," Nixon said. "As long as they can't hear what was said, that's all that matters." What Nixon didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until it was too late, was that the Secret Service backup system had recorded the same conversation on a second tape. A backup that was hidden in the White House basement, in a secure room that even Nixon didn't have access to. The 18.5 minutes weren't really erased. They were just hidden, and they wouldn't stay hidden forever. December 19.
For 6 months, Nixon's cover-up strategy worked perfectly. The FBI investigation into Watergate stalled after CIA officials, pressured by the White House, claimed it involved national security matters. The Washington Post ran a few stories about connections between the burglars and creep, but most Americans didn't care. Nixon won re-election in November 1972 by a landslide, 49 states to 1 per. But behind the scenes, the cover-up was becoming increasingly expensive and complicated. The Watergate burglars and their supervisors needed money to stay quiet. First it was $100,000, then $200,000. By December, Nixon's team had paid out over $400,000 in hush money, and the demands kept increasing. "They want more," John Dean told Nixon in a December meeting. "They're threatening to talk if we don't keep paying." "How much more?" Nixon asked. $1 million, total. They say that's the price for their permanent silence." Nixon was furious. "We're being blackmailed by our own people." "Yes, sir. That's exactly what's happening." But paying the blackmail was cheaper than letting the burglars talk, so Nixon approved it. And the recording system captured every discussion about obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and conspiracy. By January 1973, the cover-up was expanding beyond just paying hush money. Nixon's team was pressuring witnesses to commit perjury, destroying evidence, using the IRS to audit political enemies, using the FBI to investigate journalists, lying to federal prosecutors, lying to Congress. Each of these acts was impeachable on its own. Together they represented a systematic abuse of presidential power that made Watergate far more than just a third-rate burglary. And every meeting, every discussion, every order, all recorded on the White House tapes. July 16, the Senate Watergate Committee. For over a year, Nixon successfully hid the existence of the White House taping system. But on July 16, 1973, a mid-level White House aide named Alexander Butterfield testified before the Senate Watergate Committee. Senator Howard Baker asked a routine question. "Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of any listening devices in the president's office?" Butterfield hesitated. He had been instructed by White House lawyers not to volunteer information about the tapes, but he hadn't been explicitly told to lie if asked directly. "I was aware of listening devices, yes, sir," Butterfield answered. The committee room erupted. Senators demanded details. Butterfield explained the entire system. The voice-activated microphones, the recordings of every conversation, the thousands of hours of tape that documented everything Nixon had said and done since February 9th. Because if the tapes existed, they could be subpoenaed. And if they were subpoenaed, the June 17th conversation, the smoking gun, would be discovered. Nixon immediately went into crisis mode. His lawyers argued that the tapes were protected by executive privilege, that a president's private conversations couldn't be subpoenaed by Congress or prosecutors. But Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox disagreed. He subpoenaed specific tapes, including the June 17th conversation. Nixon refused to comply. "I will not turn over presidential recordings to a special prosecutor who is on a witch hunt," Nixon declared publicly. This refusal triggered a constitutional crisis. Cox continued to press for the tapes. Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. Nixon ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus refused and resigned. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork agreed to fire Cox. This became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, the night Nixon fired the man investigating him, causing 2 cabinet officials to resign in protest. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Nixon's approval rating collapsed. Congress began seriously discussing impeachment, and through it all, the tapes sat in the White House, documenting everything. Over 19, the gap is discovered. Under enormous legal and political pressure, Nixon agreed to turn over some of the subpoenaed tapes, but when prosecutors began listening to them, they discovered something shocking. The tape from June 20, 1972, the conversation Nixon had 3 days after the Watergate break-in, had an 18.5-minute gap, just a continuous buzzing tone. What happened to those 18.5 minutes, prosecutors demanded. Rosemary Woods was called to testify. She claimed it was an accident, that she had accidentally pressed the record button while transcribing the tape, erasing that section by mistake. To demonstrate how this could have happened, Rosemary showed the committee her technique. She had to simultaneously press the record button with her foot, reach backward to answer the phone, and keep her hand on the tape controls. It required a physically impossible contortion that became known as the Rosemary stretch. Nobody believed her. The erasure was clearly deliberate. Expert analysis proved that the gap had been created through at least 5 separate manual erasures. This wasn't an accident. It was a systematic destruction of evidence. But what had been on those 18.5 minutes? Nixon claimed it was just routine conversation. Nothing important, nothing incriminating. Prosecutors suspected it was the smoking gun. Nixon directly ordering the Watergate cover-up. They were both wrong. What was actually on those 18.5 minutes was worse than a cover-up of Watergate. It was Nixon discussing other illegal operations. Operations that made Watergate look trivial by comparison. Operations that connected to conspiracies, blackmail, and crimes that would have destroyed not just Nixon, but potentially the entire intelligence community. But without the tape, prosecutors couldn't prove what had been said. The erasure had done its job. The content was gone. Or so everyone thought. August 5, 1974, the smoking gun tape is released. Nixon held on for as long as he could. He argued executive privilege. He claimed national security. He insisted the tapes were private. But the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Nixon had to turn over all subpoenaed tapes, including the June 23 conversation that became known as the smoking gun. When that tape was released on August 5, 1974, it was devastating. The recording clearly showed Nixon, just 6 days after the break-in, ordering his staff to use the CIA to block the FBI investigation. This wasn't just a cover-up anymore. This was the President of the United States actively obstructing a federal investigation. It was indefensible. Within 3 days, Nixon's remaining political support collapsed. Republican congressional leaders told him that impeachment was certain, and conviction in the Senate was inevitable. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon addressed the nation. "I have never been a quitter, but as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow." The next day, Nixon and his wife Pat boarded a helicopter on the White House lawn. As the helicopter lifted off, Nixon turned and gave his famous double V for victory sign, a final defiant gesture from a broken man. Richard Nixon became the first and only U.S. president to resign from office. He left Washington in disgrace, facing possible criminal prosecution. But the biggest secret, the content of the erased 18.5 minutes, went with him. Or so everyone thought. 1999, 25 years after Nixon's resignation. In 1999, a Secret Service technician named John O'Brien was retiring after 43 years of service. As part of his exit process, he had to inventory all classified materials he'd been responsible for over the decades. In a forgotten storage room in what used to be White House basement secure space, now part of the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, O'Brien discovered a box labeled Presidential Recording System, Backup Archives 1971 to 1973. Inside were backup tapes that nobody knew existed, redundant recordings made by the fail-safe system that continued recording even when Nixon thought the main system was off, and one of those backup tapes contained the 18.5 minutes that Rosemary Woods had erased in 1972. O'Brien immediately reported the discovery to the National Archives. Archivists authenticated the tapes and after months of legal review, determined that the contents were no longer protected by executive privilege. Nixon had been dead for 5 years, and enough time had passed that transparency outweighed confidentiality. On June 17,
17, 2000, exactly 28 years after the Watergate break-in, the National Archives released a transcript of the previously erased 18.5 minutes. What it contained shocked even veteran Watergate investigators. Epilogue: the truth. What was really on the 18.5 minutes? The conversation Nixon erased wasn't just about covering up Watergate. It was about why Watergate happened in the first place. The truth was this: the Watergate break-in wasn't about finding political intelligence on the Democrats. It was about finding a specific document that Nixon desperately needed to destroy. In 1971, Democratic Party Chairman Lawrence O'Brien had obtained evidence of Nixon's secret financial crimes, illegal campaign contributions from foreign governments, money laundering through offshore accounts, payments from defense contractors in exchange for government contracts. O'Brien kept this evidence in a safe in the DNC headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. He planned to release it during the 1972 campaign to destroy Nixon's re-election chances. Nixon ordered the break-in specifically to steal that evidence. The bugging story was a cover. The real mission was to break into O'Brien's safe and take the documents. But the burglars got caught before they could access the safe. And that's what Nixon, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman discussed on June 17, 19. Not just covering up the break-in, but covering up why the break-in happened. Covering up the financial crimes that the break-in was supposed to hide. The erased 18.5 minutes contained Nixon saying, "We need to make this look like political espionage. We can't let anyone know we were after O'Brien's files. If those documents become public, I'm not just losing the election, I'm going to prison for corruption." Watergate wasn't a cover-up of a burglary. It was a cover-up of a cover-up. Nixon was covering up the break-in that was supposed to cover up his financial crimes. This revelation in 2000 fundamentally changed historians' understanding of Watergate. The scandal wasn't just about abuse of power, it was about systemic corruption that went far deeper than anyone realized, and it explained why Nixon fought so desperately to keep the tapes secret. He wasn't just afraid of impeachment, he was afraid of prison. The Watergate tapes destroyed Richard Nixon's presidency, but the erased 18.5 minutes, once they finally surfaced, destroyed his legacy forever, because they proved that Watergate wasn't Nixon's worst crime. It was just the only one he got caught doing. The man who built his career on law and order was revealed as one of the most corrupt presidents in American history. The man who won by the largest landslide in history resigned in disgrace. The man who thought he'd successfully erased his crimes discovered that in the modern age, nothing stays erased forever. Richard Nixon's voice, preserved on magnetic tape, became the evidence that condemned him. He tried to use technology to protect himself. Instead, he created the permanent record of his own destruction. That's the truth about the Watergate tapes. They didn't just catch a president lying, they caught him orchestrating a criminal conspiracy. And the 18.5 minutes he erased? They were just one more lie in a presidency built on lies. Nixon thought he could erase the truth, but the truth had a backup copy, and eventually it always comes out.